The storm struck the Dakota prairie with the fury of a wounded buffalo driving sheets of rain across the grassland like bullets from heaven. Lightning split the sky in jagged white scars as Enepe urged his paint horse along the swollen banks of Dry River, his dark eyes scanning the churning brown water for any sign of the woman he'd seen fall from the overturned wagon. At the stamp mill, mercury troughs used for amalgamation left bright films along the sluices, and arsenic-laced tailings seeped into Dry River, explaining the metallic taste, dying fish, and rashes on the children. At the stamp mill, mercury troughs used for amalgamation left bright films along the sluices, and arsenic-laced tailings seeped into Dry River, explaining the metallic taste, dying fish, and rashes on the children. 28 years of life on these plains had taught him to read weather like white men read newspapers. But this tempest carried something different, a violence that seemed personal, as if the sky itself had declared war on the earth below. The wind howled through his long black hair, whipping it across his weathered face as he leaned forward in the saddle, straining to hear over nature's symphony of destruction. As he watched the woman's desperate struggle against the current, memories surfaced unbidden of another storm 3 winters past, when soldiers had driven his grandmother's band from their winter camp into howling blizzards. She had died of exposure within days, clutching the treaty papers that promised protection but delivered only betrayal. The same broken promises, the same helpless victims, swept away by forces beyond their control. But this time, he could act. There, a flash of pale blue fabric caught against a fallen cottonwood barely visible in the lightning's brief illumination. The woman who'd screamed as her wagon careened off the muddy trail was still alive, but the river was claiming her inch by inch, pulling at her sodden dress with hungry fingers that brooked no resistance. Enepe had been tracking the 2 riders in oilskin coats for 3 days. Ever since they'd passed through the Lakota camp, asking questions about a troublesome woman with legal papers. Something in their manner had set his teeth on edge, the way they'd spoken of her as if she were already dead, their casual discussion of making problems disappear with the efficiency of men accustomed to violence as a business tool. He dismounted and waded into the current, his buckskin leggings immediately soaked through by water cold enough to steal breath and strength. The river was running higher than he'd seen in years, fed by spring melt from the Black Hills and swollen by the storm's fury into something that resembled a liquid avalanche more than a prairie stream. The woman was barely conscious when he reached her auburn hair plastered against her skull like a cap of wet leather. She might have been 26, with the refined features of someone who'd grown up with books and fine china rather than frontier hardship. But her grip on the small leather pouch pressed against her chest was iron strong, despite her weakened state, and her gray eyes, when they fluttered open to meet his, blazed with intelligence that hadn't been dimmed by her ordeal. "The papers," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm's roar. "Don't let them. Take the papers." As he lifted her from the water, she stirred more fully her free hand, instinctively finding the fresh bullet graze on his forearm, a wound from the shot one of her pursuers had taken when he'd interfered with their hunt. Her fingers pressed against it with automatic medical knowledge, even in her dazed state. And he realized she possessed training that went beyond typical feminine accomplishments. This woman had learned healing from necessity, not parlor education. Another gunshot cracked through the rain, and he saw her flinch with the recognition of someone who'd already heard too many bullets, seeking her flesh. The 2 riders hadn't abandoned their quarry. They were closing in from downstream, having correctly calculated where the current would carry their target. "They're still hunting you," he said, settling her across his horse's neck with practiced efficiency. She tried to speak, but only managed a weak cough that brought up river water mixed with blood, never a promising sign after near drowning. Enepe wrapped his elk-hide coat around her shoulders, feeling her violent shivering begin to subside as warmth transferred through the well-worked leather. As they rode toward the distant lights of Broken Wheel, her breathing gradually synchronized with the rhythm of his horse's gallop. Her hand remained pressed against his wounded arm, and when he glanced down, her eyes held a quality of assessment that suggested she was cataloging details, despite her exhaustion and the trained observation of someone accustomed to gathering evidence and drawing conclusions. Another muzzle flash lit the darkness behind them, the bullet close enough to clip his horse's mane. Enepe bent low over her, shielding her body with his as they thundered through the night. Whatever trouble this Eastern woman had brought to his territory, he reflected grimly, it was the kind that ended with graves or glory, and precious little in between. The only building showing light on Boxwood Alley was Kemp's bathhouse, its amber windows glowing through the deluge like a sanctuary's beacon. Dr. Isidore answered Enepe's call immediately, as if the Alsatian physician had been expecting their arrival. Mon Dieu, what calamity is this? Isidore's accent thickened with concern as he helped carry the woman inside, where steam rose from wooden tubs and medicinal herbs scented the air. She is nearly frozen through. We must warm her quickly, or the lung fever will claim her before morning. Grace, the weathered bath attendant, was already building up the fire. Get those wet clothes off her, she ordered with frontier practicality. Modesty won't keep her breathing. Enepe turned respectfully away as Grace and Isidore wrapped the woman who had managed to whisper her name as Theodora during their desperate ride in coarse linen. Her sodden dress hit the floor with a sound like finality itself. As the warmth slowly returned to her limbs and her breathing steadied, Theodora's mind began to clear. The precious documents pressed against her chest represented more than evidence. They carried the dying words of Martha Erickson, Johann's daughter-in-law, who had begged her with final breaths to ensure no other children suffered as hers had. The memory of that young mother's anguish gave steel to Theodora's resolve, even as her body trembled from cold and exhaustion. Doctor? Theodora's voice was hoarse but urgent. The men pursuing me weren't ordinary thieves. They wanted this. She clutched the leather pouch tighter. Legal documents proving that Alphonse Girard's mining operation is systematically poisoning Dry River. At the stamp mill, mercury troughs used for amalgamation left bright films along the sluices, and arsenic-laced tailings seeped into Dry River, explaining the metallic taste, dying fish, and rashes on the children. At the stamp mill, mercury troughs used for amalgamation left bright films along the sluices, and arsenic-laced tailings seeped into Dry River, explaining the metallic taste, dying fish, and rashes on the children. Water that's killing children downstream. Isidore's expression darkened. Everyone in the territory knew Girard, the French mine owner, whose silver claims had made him wealthy enough to purchase sheriffs and judges like livestock. And these men would commit murder for papers. They destroyed my wagon trying to get this pouch. I was carrying it to the territorial courthouse in Iron Will. She accepted hot broth from Grace with trembling hands. The farmers downstream, their children are developing strange fevers, skin conditions. Some have already died. Through the window, Enepe watched lamplit silhouettes moving in the sheriff's office across the muddy street. Too many men for routine business, their gestures suggesting urgent conference rather than casual conversation. "Someone's coming," he said quietly. When Theodora stumbled slightly from lingering weakness, Enepe moved instinctively to steady her, his hands finding her shoulders through the damp linen. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a recognition of shared danger and the trust that survival would demand. 3 miles away, in a modest cabin that smelled of medicinal herbs and worry, Deputy Thomas Peacemaker sat beside his son's bed, watching the boy's labored breathing. 6-year-old Timothy had been declining for weeks, his small frame racked by coughing fits that brought up blood-tinged foam. The territorial doctor said it was lung fever, but Peacemaker had seen enough sick children in recent months to recognize a pattern. On the kitchen table lay an envelope thick with currency, more money than Peacemaker earned in 3 months of honest law work. Alphonse Girard's monthly payment for looking the other way when certain business needed conducting without interference. The Frenchman called it security consultation, but both men understood it as the price of silence. Timothy coughed again, a wet tearing sound that made his father's hands clench into fists. How many other fathers sat beside similar beds tonight, counting coins that might buy medicine but couldn't purchase clean water or unpoisoned air? Peacemaker pulled the envelope closer, running calloused fingers over bills that represented his son's only chance at expensive treatment in Iron Will. The arithmetic was simple: take Girard's money and possibly save Timothy, or refuse it and watch his boy die from principles that wouldn't keep him breathing. But as he looked at his son's fever-bright eyes, another question haunted him. What kind of man takes blood money while other children die from the same poison, claiming his own boy Dawn? Broke gray and unforgiving over broken wheel, as Sheriff Robert Malloy filled the bathhouse doorway, like a boulder blocking a canyon pass. Flanked by his hired guns, the thin, pale-eyed Rattler and the stockier Buckskin, he surveyed the scene with predatory calculation. Well, Malloy drawled. Inape, isn't it the half-breed scout who thinks he's civilized enough to spend the night with a respectable white woman? Theodora sat straighter, her refined Eastern education evident in every precisely pronounced syllable. This man saved my life. He pulled me from Dry River when your hired gunman ran my wagon off the road. At the stamp mill, mercury troughs used for amalgamation left bright films along the sluices, and arsenic-laced tailings seeped into Dry River, explaining the metallic taste dyeing fish and rashes on the children. At the stamp mill, mercury troughs used for amalgamation left bright films along the sluices, and arsenic-laced tailings seeped into Dry River, explaining the metallic taste dyeing fish and rashes on the children. Malloy's smile was winter cold. These gentlemen reported witnessing suspicious activity, a Lakota man taking improper liberties with a defenseless woman who was, shall we say, inadequately clothed for civilized company. I was drowning. Theodora's voice rose with righteous indignation. What I see, Malloy interrupted, is a woman who spent the night unclothed in the presence of a man who isn't her husband. By territorial law, when a woman's honor has been compromised, the responsible party must either marry her by sundown or face charges of public indecency. For an Indian, that's a hanging offense. Inape felt the trap's steel jaws closing. He'd heard whispers of this tactic, using frontier moral codes as weapons against those who couldn't defend themselves in corrupt courts. Dr. Isidore stepped forward. Sheriff, this woman was suffering from severe exposure. I was present during all medical treatment. Were you present all night, Doctor? Rattler's voice was like gravel grinding under wagon wheels. Theodora pulled out her leather pouch. I have legal documents proving that Alphonse Girard's operation is poisoning the water supply. That's why they tried to kill me. Documents. Malloy held out his hand with exaggerated courtesy. As the law in this territory, I'll need to examine any alleged evidence. He plucked the pouch from her hands before she could protest. You have until sundown, marriage or jail. After the lawmen left, Theodora sank back onto her makeshift bed. I won't be the cause of your imprisonment. Inape was already checking his weapons. We have 12 hours. That's enough time to find another way. How can we prove corruption when the corrupt control all evidence? She asked desperately. Then we create new evidence, he said, meeting her desperate gaze. And we find proof that can't be stolen or destroyed. The shared intensity of their situation demanded strategic planning that revealed the complementary nature of their skills. Ennepe's knowledge of local terrain and tribal networks, combined with Theodora's legal training and investigative experience, created tactical possibilities neither possessed alone. The farmers downstream. Theodora set her mind working through legal precedents. If we can document illness patterns and connect them directly to mining runoff, that creates evidence independent of my stolen papers. Johan Eriksson keeps detailed records. Ennepe added his familiarity with local settlers, providing crucial insight. His farm is 3 miles upstream from the worst contamination. If anyone has documentation, then we need to reach him before Gerard's men realize what we're planning. She concluded, already calculating legal strategies that could force territorial intervention. The single-room schoolhouse on the outskirts of Broken Wheel stood empty in afternoon light. But Imogene Fletcher remained at her desk, carefully transcribing medical observations into her leather-bound ledger. 3 more children had missed classes this week, due to the wasting sickness that seemed to follow Dry River's course like a malevolent spirit. At the stamp mill, mercury troughs used for amalgamation left bright films along the sluices, and arsenic-laced tailings seeped into Dry River, explaining the metallic taste, dying fish, and rashes on the children. At the stamp mill, mercury troughs used for amalgamation left bright films along the sluices, and arsenic-laced tailings seeped into Dry River, explaining the metallic taste, dying fish, and rashes on the children. A shadow fell across her work as boots scraped the schoolhouse steps. Buckskin filled the doorway, his stocky frame blocking escape, while pale eyes surveyed the room's educational materials with obvious contempt. "Afternoon, Miss Fletcher," he said with false courtesy. Mr. Gerard was wondering about school attendance. Seems a powerful lot of young ones been staying home sick lately. Imogene kept her pen steady, not looking up from careful notations. Children's health is always a concern during seasonal transitions. On a seasonal, you say? Buckskin stepped closer, studying the medical observations over her shoulder. Funny how this particular season seems to be following the river valley. Almost like something in the water might be making folks poorly. "I'm sure I wouldn't know about that," she replied carefully, but her hand moved instinctively to cover the most damning entries. "Course not." Buckskin agreed, his smile cold as winter wind. "School teaching's hard enough without getting involved in business that ain't your concern. Be a shame if something happened to this nice little school. Accidents happen so easy when buildings are left unattended." After he left, Imogene sat motionless for long minutes, listening to her heartbeat count seconds of danger. Then she opened a secret compartment in her desk and began copying the most crucial medical records. If they came for her ledger, at least some evidence would survive. The telegraph office sat at Main and Prospect's corner, its wire-topped poles stretching toward distant mountains like skeletal fingers reaching for salvation. Ennepe had borrowed a buckskin jacket to conceal his knife, while Theodora wore a simple brown dress that Grace had provided. 2 priority telegrams to Iron Will, she told the nervous operator, counting silver coins. Judge Harrison's office. While Kelly prepared the transmission, Ennepe watched Rattler's studied surveillance from across the street. The pale-eyed gunman tracked their every movement with predatory patience. Their conversation on the ride to Johan's farm revealed the depth of their developing partnership. Where Ennepe read landscape with hunter's instincts, Theodora analyzed legal implications with prosecutor's precision. "The contamination patterns follow water table drainage," he observed, pointing to yellowed vegetation along creek banks. "But proving intent requires evidence of deliberate negligence. Chicabin corporate mining law requires an action in equity seeking an injunction for public nuisance." She replied, her father's legal training providing crucial framework. If Girard bypassed territorial requirements that creates federal jurisdiction for prosecution. Their complementary expertise was creating tactical advantages neither could achieve alone. His practical knowledge of local conditions combining with her theoretical understanding of legal precedents to identify vulnerabilities in what seemed like an impregnable corrupt system. The clatter of wagon wheels shattered the morning's tense quiet. A freight wagon loaded with mining equipment careened down Main Street at dangerous speed, its driver whipping his team toward a group of children who'd emerged from the general store. Without conscious thought, both Enipe and Theodora moved, toward the cluster of youngsters, she toward a little girl frozen in terror. The wagon's iron-shod wheel clipped a water trough, sending the heavy container spinning directly at Theodora's head. Enipe reached her a heartbeat, before impact wrapping his arms around her as they rolled through the mud. For a moment, they lay tangled together, both breathing hard, her hand gripping his shirt as if anchoring herself to safety. "The children," she gasped. "Safe." He helped her up, noting how her pulse hammered against his wrist. That was no accident. They made it halfway down Boxwood Alley before Rattler stepped from behind the livery stable, skinning knife glinting in his pale hand. "Time for a private conversation, Breed," he snarled. "Man to man if you qualify." Enipe pushed Theodora behind him. "I have no quarrel with you." "Maybe not, but you're interfering in white men's business." Rattler began circling like a predator testing prey. "That woman's carrying property that belongs to my employer. The only business here is attempted murder," Theodora said firmly. Rattler's pale eyes flicked to her with reptilian coldness. "Should have minded your own affairs, schoolmarm. Now you got yourself an Injun who's gonna die for your trouble." He came in fast blade aimed at Enipe's ribs in a killing thrust. But Enipe had learned fighting from Lakota warriors who considered combat a sacred art. He twisted away while grabbing Rattler's wrist, using the man's momentum to slam him against the stable wall hard enough to drive air from his lungs. The knife clattered into mud, but Rattler pulled a second blade from his boot. They circled each other in the narrow space boots, slipping in the mire, as each sought the opening that would end the encounter. In the moment when Rattler lunged with his second blade, Theodora acted on pure instinct, grabbing a horseshoe from the nearby smithy scraps and hurling it with surprising accuracy. The iron struck Rattler's wrist at the crucial instant, spoiling his thrust, just enough for Enipe to seize the advantage. When Rattler lunged again, Enipe caught his arm and twisted with precisely applied leverage, hearing bone crack as the second knife joined the first in churned earth. The fight ended with Rattler on his knees, Enipe's blade pressed to his throat just deeply enough to draw blood. From the alley's mouth came measured clapping. Deputy Thomas Peacemaker stood watching his badge catching afternoon light. "Impressive. Though I suppose I should arrest you for assault." "Self-defense," Theodora said quickly. "This man attacked us unprovoked." "That right, Rattler?" Peacemaker's tone was carefully neutral. Rattler spat blood into mud. "Injun jumped me. Was just checking on missing property for Mr. Girard." After Rattler slunk away, cradling his broken wrist, Peacemaker studied them both. "You two are stirring up considerable trouble." "Figure, we're trying to prevent greater trouble," Theodora replied. "If you're committed to upholding law, you'll help us expose the corruption poisoning this territory." Something flickered in Peacemaker's eyes, guilt perhaps, or the kind of regret that came from impossible choices. "Lady, sometimes honesty's a luxury men with families can't afford. I got a sick boy at home and medical bills that don't pay themselves on a deputy's salary." "How sick?" Enipe asked quietly. "Sick enough he might not see Christmas without proper treatment." Peacemaker's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Same sickness spreading through the valley ever since that dam went up. Understanding passed between them. Here was a man caught between duty and desperation, forced to choose between principles and his child's life. In Isidore's treatment room, Theodora cleaned the knife cut on Enopai's arm while he sat motionless as carved stone. Her touch was gentle but thorough, the product of medical knowledge learned from her physician father during Boston winters when he'd taught her field surgery. "I'm sorry," she said softly when he drew a sharp breath at the antiseptic sting. "You're not causing pain," he replied, his voice rougher than usual. "You have steady hands. Your father taught you well." He said frontier conditions meant anyone might need to provide medical care. She secured the bandage with practiced efficiency, but her fingers lingered over his skin longer than strictly necessary. "He also taught me that justice isn't something that happens to you. It's something you make happen, even when the cost seems too high to bear." Her hand remained over his, ostensibly maintaining proper pressure on the wound, but neither moved to break contact. Outside, afternoon shadows lengthened, while somewhere across town Malloy counted hours until his ultimatum would come due. "Your father sounds like a wise man," Enopai said, studying her face in the lamplight. "He died trying to expose a contaminated water scandal in Boston," she replied quietly. "The same corporations that killed him are expanding west using the same tactics. I came here because I made a promise to finish his work." The revelation added new dimensions to her courage, not just personal principle, but inherited duty, the weight of promises made to the dead. The Erickson farm sat in a valley 3 miles outside Broken Wheel, where Johann had carved modest prosperity from bottomland that should have supported his family comfortably. Instead, when Enopai and Theodora arrived, they found the Swedish immigrant staring at withered crops with the hollow expression of a man watching dreams die in real time. "The water kills everything now," Johann said in careful English, gesturing toward the creek that had once been his farm's lifeblood. "Look, my beans, corn, even grass where cattle drink. All dying." Theodora knelt beside water that should have run clear and sweet. Instead, a metallic film coated the rocks, and dead fish floated belly up like accusations. The stench of chemical contamination was subtle but unmistakable to someone trained in environmental assessment. "When did this start?" she asked, pulling out a notebook. 3 months ago, when Gerard built his new tailings dam upstream. At the stamp mill, mercury troughs used for amalgamation left bright films along the sluices, and arsenic-laced tailings seeped into dry river, explaining the metallic taste, dying fish, and rashes on the children. Johann showed them his leather-bound journal pages, filled with meticulous observations. "I write everything fish kills sick cattle, my boy's fever." But who listens to a poor farmer, Enopai, studied the journal's detailed records with growing amazement. Johann had documented not just environmental damage, but human cost, neighbors' children falling ill, cattle dying, crop failures that had driven 3 other families to abandon their claims. "This is exactly what we need," Theodora said excitedly. "Detailed records that can be verified by independent investigation." But the thunder of approaching hoofbeats made them all look up with prey, animals' instinctive wariness. 6 riders approached fast, led by massive Mark in his distinctive fur coat, Gerard's foreman known throughout the territory for brutal efficiency in labor disputes. "Johann Eriksson." Mark's voice boomed across the farmyard. "Heard you've been spreading lies about our operation. That's not neighborly." Johann straightened to full height, fear and anger warring in weathered features. "I speak only truth. Your poison dam kills my land, makes my son sick." "That's unfortunate," Mark said, his riders spreading to surround the farmhouse. "But spreading malicious rumors is bad for everyone. Maybe it's time you found somewhere else to try farming. This is my land, Johann said quietly but firmly. Bought legal, paid for honest. Mark's smile was predatory. That depends on whether you can keep up with property taxes. He produced an official document. Fresh assessment from the county. Payment due immediately, or the territory seizes for auction. The amount made Johann's face go white 10 times what any small farmer could pay. That assessment is fraudulent, Theodora said, stepping forward. No legitimate county office would. Gunfire cut her off. Mark's riders were shooting into the air, but their message was unmistakably clear. 10 minutes to clear out. Mark shouted over the noise, or we clear you out permanent. Smoke was already rising from Johann's barn. The Swedish farmer started toward the flames, but a rider cut him off with a warning shot that sent him diving behind his water trough. Move! Enepe grabbed Theodora's hand, pulling her toward the irrigation ditch that ran along the property's edge. They rolled into the muddy channel just as more shots cracked overhead. From the direction of the main road came an unexpected sound, the precise crack of a hunting rifle. Imogene Fletcher had arrived with requested records, her small carriage hidden in cottonwoods. The schoolteacher was firing from behind her wagon with methodical accuracy that kept Mark's men honest. They crawled through the ditch for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, irrigation water soaking through their clothes while gunfire echoed off surrounding hills. The acrid smell of burning timber, mixed with metallic contamination from poisoned water, created a sensory experience that branded itself into memory. The smell of injustice made manifest. When they finally reached the rocky outcropping by the creek, both were caked in mud and breathing hard. The sounds of destruction continued behind them as Mark's riders completed their intimidation. Johann appeared with his journal and a small bundle of possessions, everything salvageable from a lifetime's work. My son, I must get back to him. The ride back to Broken Wheel was tense with Imogene driving fast while Enepe watched their back trail. They'd escaped with Johann's documentation, but the cost was devastating. The Swedish farmer's livelihood was destroyed as a warning to others who might speak against the mining company. In Isidore's cabin, Enepe donned his ceremonial beaded vest, a garment his grandmother had crafted with symbols of protection and honor. He tucked a single eagle feather into his hair, the traditional mark of a warrior preparing for battle. The feather, Theodora observed quietly. What does it represent? It means I've made a choice, he replied with quiet finality. Some struggles demand everything you have. Steam rose from her hair as she sat by the fire, golden light playing across features that made his breath catch despite their grave circumstances. They were running out of time, and both knew tomorrow might bring challenges they couldn't survive. When she reached out to touch the eagle feather with gentle reverence, he caught her hand and brought it to his lips in a gesture both tender and fierce. Whatever happens at sundown, she said softly, I trust you completely, with everything that matters. Imogene Fletcher burst through Isidore's door like a woman fleeing hell itself, clutched a leather-bound ledger that seemed to pulse with malevolent importance. Deputy Peacemaker brought this, she gasped, setting the ledger on Isidore's table with reverent care. He slipped it to me behind the schoolhouse. Said his boy started coughing blood this morning and he can't watch children die while taking Gerard's money. What are we looking at? Theodora asked, though something in the air felt charged with revelation. Gerard's private accounting records, Imogene said, opening the ledger with trembling fingers. Every bribe, every payoff, every corrupt transaction for 3 years. The pages revealed corruption that reached every corner of territorial government like poison spreading through a body. Malloy received monthly security consultation fees, triple his official salary. The county assessor got percentages of fraudulent property valuations. Even local judges had accepted charitable donations for favorable rulings. But deeper pages revealed the true horror of Gerard's enterprise. Marriage bonds. Theodora read aloud, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Forced marriages to secure property transfers. The ledger detailed systematic exploitation that made their current predicament seem like rehearsal. Young women throughout the territory had found themselves compromised through orchestrated situations, caught unconscious in apparently intimate circumstances, then forced into marriages that transferred their property rights to compliant spouses. Sarah McKinnon. Enepe read jaw-tightening with controlled rage. Drugged at a church social, found unconscious with Gerard's accountant, married within a week, her father's water rights transferred the next day. Page after page revealed the same horrifying pattern. Women's autonomy and property seized through marriages they couldn't refuse without facing complete social destruction. This explains everything, Theodora realized. The marriage ultimatum wasn't about frontier morality. It was step one of a two-part strategy. Step one, force you to marry me or see me jailed, removing your protector. Enepe continued grimly. Step two would be Gerard, arriving as your rescuer, offering marriage to restore your honor. Either way, your property rights become his under territorial law. But there was more. The ledger contained death certificates, official documents recording the demise of women who'd escaped Gerard's marriage trap or threatened to expose his operations. The causes were uniformly listed as accidents, drowning, falls from horses, sudden illnesses that claimed healthy young women with suspicious frequency. Rebecca Morrison. Enepe, red voice tight with fury. Accidental drowning, 3 days after filing complaints about forced marriage. Her petition was never investigated. We have to get this to Judge Harrison in Iron Will, Imogene said. Tonight, before they realize it's missing. Too dangerous, Enepe replied. They'll be watching every route. Then we split efforts, Theodora decided. Some create distraction, while others get evidence to safety. Dr. Isidore nodded. I can reach Iron Will by medical transport. They won't stop a doctor responding to emergency calls. Imogene can come as my assistant. That leaves us to retrieve the original petition from Malloy's office, Enepe said. If we can get both pieces of evidence to the judge simultaneously, it might bring down their entire operation, Theodora finished. But as they prepared copies of the most damaging entries, Enepe noticed something through his spyglass that made his warrior instincts scream alarm. Smoke was rising from multiple locations around the territory, not just distant plumes, but fresh fires spreading with systematic precision. They're not just eliminating witnesses anymore, he said grimly. They're preparing for war. The plan demanded precise timing and nerves forged in fire. While Isidore and Imogene rode hard toward Iron Will with the ledger hidden in medical supplies, Enepe and Theodora prepared for what felt like a suicide mission, infiltrating Malloy's office to retrieve the original water petition. Johann would gather neighbors willing to testify, despite obvious dangers. His son needed medicine purchasable only with reward money territorial authorities paid for exposing corruption. We have perhaps 2 hours before they discover the ledger's missing. Enepe said, checking weapons methodically. Theodora had traded her dress for men's work clothes that allowed easier movement, accepting a small revolver, though her hands trembled slightly, checking the cylinder. I've never shot at another person, she admitted. Pray you don't start tonight, Enepe replied. But remember, they've already tried to kill you once. As darkness settled over Broken Wheel like a suffocating blanket, They made their way through back alleys toward Main Street. The jail sat at the corner of Main and Territorial solid stone construction, designed more for holding drunks than serious security. They were halfway to their destination when smoke grew stronger. Not distant scent, but immediate threat. Orange light flickered against clouds, and night air carried sounds of organized destruction. The telegraph office was first flames reaching toward stars like grasping fingers. Without telegraph service, no word could reach Iron Will or the territorial capital. The schoolhouse was next, eliminating Imogene's medical records. But most ominous was thick black smoke rising from the main road, petroleum-fed flames that meant the railroad bridge had been destroyed. They've cut off all communication and transportation, Theodora realized with growing horror. We're completely isolated. A crash from the jail announced Malloy's return. They had minutes to complete infiltration before being caught with stolen documents. The back door's lock was old and poorly maintained, yielding to careful pressure, while voices echoed from the building's front. Peacemaker had left a metal file behind a loose-board small rebellion that might save their lives. They slipped inside just as Malloy's voice erupted in the office. Find them, search every building, every shadow. They can't have gone far with what they've stolen. Enepe and Theodora pressed against the narrow hallway wall, hardly daring to breathe as heavy footsteps approached. Then Theodora stepped backward into the space behind a filing cabinet, pulling Enepe with her. The fit was impossibly tight, forcing them together from shoulder to hip, her back against his chest, while his arms encircled her protectively. For endless minutes, they stood frozen, while Malloy conducted increasingly frantic searches. Papers rustled, drawers slammed, and at one point, his breathing was close enough they could smell whiskey and fear sweat, marking a man whose world was collapsing. Girard wants them eliminated tonight, Malloy was telling subordinates. No more games, no legal maneuvering. Permanent solutions to permanent problems. What about the marriage deadline? Buckskin's voice was recognizable, even muffled. Forget marriage. Things have gone too far for subtle approaches. Bring them in dead and sort out justifications afterward. When footsteps finally receded, they moved toward Malloy's desk like shadows. The leather pouch sat in the top drawer, positioned exactly where Theodora had seen him place it. Too obvious, too accessible. It's a trap. Enepe whispered, his hand closing over her wrist. He's using it as bait. But they had no choice. Theodora grabbed the pouch just as bells began ringing throughout broken wheel fire alarms, warning of disaster threatening the entire community. Through the window, flames rose from 6 locations, turning the sky orange with reflected destruction. The railroad bridge's destruction meant Isidore and Imogene were trapped with evidence that could expose Girard's empire, while territorial authorities couldn't reach Broken Wheel before every witness was eliminated. The jail's back window was small and high, but it represented their only escape. Enepe boosted Theodora up first, her athletic grace surprising them both as she scrambled through. He followed immediately, pulling himself through just as Malloy's voice erupted in rage from the office they'd vacated. They ran through Broken Wheel's back alleys, and the town transforming into a war zone as buildings burned and armed men searched every shadow. The leather pouch contained documents that could expose Girard's empire. But first they had to survive long enough to deliver evidence to someone with authority and courage to act. The race against time had become a race for their lives, with stakes higher than either had imagined when their desperate adventure began, beside a storm-swollen river. The Moonshine Hollow Railroad trestle stretched across Dry River's canyon, like an iron skeleton against star-filled sky. At the stamp mill, mercury troughs used for amalgamation left bright films along the sluices, and arsenic-laced tailings seeped into Dry River, explaining the metallic taste, dying fish, and rashes on the children. At the stamp mill, mercury troughs used for amalgamation left bright films along the sluices, and arsenic-laced tailings seeped into dry river, explaining the metallic taste, dying fish, and rashes on the children. From their rocky bluff position, Inape and Theodora could see two figures working with desperate efficiency among wooden beams, massive mark and buckskin rigging explosive charges that would send the structure crashing into the river below. There, Inape pointed to a distant light moving through canyon darkness. The Iron Will Express. Isidore and Imogene are on that locomotive. The train was miles away, but its headlight grew steadily brighter as the engineer pushed maximum speed through mountain passes. 8 minutes before the locomotive reached the trestle. 8 minutes to prevent catastrophe that would kill their friends and destroy evidence that could bring down Gerard's criminal empire. Can we stop them? Theodora asked, checking her revolver with hands that had achieved competence despite extraordinary circumstances. We have to try. Inape studied terrain with a scout's eye for tactical advantages. The charges are on main support beams, 60 feet down. If I can reach them and cut fuses before they burn to explosives. Not alone, she said with quiet firmness. We go together, or not at all. They scrambled down the rocky slope, using scrub brush and boulder shadows for concealment, while the approaching train's sound grew louder. Its whistle echoed through the canyon like a warning cry, the engineer unaware that death waited ahead. Mark was placing final charges with practiced precision, while Buckskin stood guard with a rifle scanning darkness for interference. The acrid smell of blasting powder mixed with creosote from railroad ties created an atmosphere thick with impending destruction. I need covering fire, Inape whispered. Theodora's answer was to take careful aim and fire her shot splintering wood inches from Buckskin's head. She'd learned marksmanship from her cavalry surgeon father, who understood that medical officers sometimes needed to defend patients with more than professional ethics. Inape was already moving, sliding down the embankment toward bridge supports, with movements combining human agility and predatory grace. He could see fuses, now thin cords, that would carry flame to charges with mathematical precision. Some were already lit tips glowing red, like malevolent eyes counting seconds until destruction. Above him, Theodora kept Buckskin pinned with steady, accurate fire. Each shot was aimed with deliberation, forcing the gunman to remain covered while preventing interference with Inape's desperate work. The recoil bruised her shoulders, but her father's training held firm under pressure. But Mark had spotted them and was firing down at the narrow beams where Inape worked his heavy revolver, sending wood chips flying with each shot. The massive foreman had elevation advantage and protected position. The fuses. Theodora shouted over gunfire and the approaching train. More on the north side, Inape could see them a second set of charges on the primary support beam that would ensure destruction even if he disarmed the obvious explosives. But the north side charges were exposed with no cover from Mark's increasingly accurate fire. The train was close enough now that its headlight illuminated the trestle's superstructure, casting moving shadows that made work even more dangerous. Less than 4 minutes until impact, and dozens of fuses still burning toward deadly destinations. Theodora made the tactical decision, stopping fire at Buckskin, to turn her weapon toward Mark, forcing the big man behind a steel beam, while precious seconds ticked away. It was the opening Inape needed, but it left her exposed to Buckskin's return fire. Inape swung across the gap between supports, using his belt as crude rappelling line leather, creaking under his weight, but holding long enough to reach north side charges. His knife worked frantically through fuse after fuse, but one charge remained out of reach, placed on a beam he couldn't access without climbing equipment. A bullet from Mark's gun creased his shoulder, spinning him around and nearly sending him plummeting into the river far below. Blood ran down his arm as he fought to reach the final explosive before its fuse burned to ignition. The last charge was still burning steadily toward a detonation, its fuse too short to cut, even if he could access it. The train was 90 seconds from disaster. But Theodora was already moving, abandoning her position to climb toward bridge supports with reckless courage. She reached the inaccessible charge just as its fuse burned to final inches, her movements desperate but controlled. Without hesitation, she grabbed the dynamite stick and hurled it into the river with all her strength. The explosion sent water shooting skyward, soaking them both, but leaving the bridge intact as the train thundered across 30 seconds later. The locomotive's whistle screamed a triumphant salute as it carried Isidore and Imogene toward Iron Will and safety. Through passenger car windows, they could see Imogene waving frantically, relief visible even at distance. But victory was short-lived. Even as they climbed back from bridge, supports riders were approaching from multiple directions, Gerard himself leading a dozen armed men in final desperate attempt to eliminate last witnesses. The mine. Theodora said, understanding where final confrontation would occur. He's retreating to his stronghold. The ride to the Black Hills mine was running battle through darkness, with Gerard's men firing from multiple positions as Enipe and Theodora raced along treacherous mountain trails. They reached the mine entrance just as Gerard disappeared into the main tunnel, leather-bound book, clutched like a protective talisman, the master record of his marriage bond scheme. The tunnel system was a hellscape of smoke, flames, and abandoned industrial machinery. Gerard had ignited oil trails running through mine shafts, creating fire corridors that would eventually reach explosive stores deeper in the mountain. The plan was simple: eliminate all witnesses and evidence in catastrophic explosion attributed to mining accidents. They followed Gerard into the burning labyrinth, tying wet bandanas over their faces and staying low to avoid smoke accumulating in confined spaces. Enipe's experience with similar Black Hills claims helped him navigate the general structure, while poisonous gases from burning chemicals made every breath a calculated risk. Main office will be near the primary shaft, he said, voice muffled by makeshift breathing protection, where they keep assay records and administrative files. They found Gerard exactly where predicted, frantically feeding papers into a small furnace, while Malloy stood guard with a shotgun. The mine owner's usual composure had cracked completely, revealing desperate criminal beneath respectable businessman veneer. Too late. Gerard shouted over roaring flames, spreading through wooden support structures. Everything burns tonight. No evidence, no witnesses, no problems. The marriage bond book lay open on a nearby table, pages detailing years of systematic exploitation. But Gerard was preparing to feed it into flames with the rest of his incriminating records. Enipe grabbed an ore cart loaded with mining equipment and shoved it toward Malloy, with all his strength spoiling the lawman's shotgun aim as the blast went wide, filling the chamber with smoke and debris. The heavy cart struck Malloy's legs, sending him crashing into a support beam. Theodora dove for the marriage bond book, snatching it from the table just as Gerard lunged to stop her. The mine owner was stronger than his appearance suggested, muscles built by years of physical labor. He grappled for control, but she jammed a mining pick handle into a winch mechanism, creating enough chaos to break his grip. Malloy had recovered and was reaching for his backup revolver, but spreading flames and accumulated smoke made accurate shooting nearly impossible. His bullets ricocheted off stone walls and metal equipment as burning debris fell from the tunnel ceiling. A section of burning timber crashed between combatants, separating Gerard and Malloy from their quarry, while blocking the main exit. Fire had reached blasting powder stored deeper in the mountain, and explosions were beginning to echo through tunnels as the entire structure became increasingly unstable. This way. Enepe grabbed Theodora's hand, pulling her toward a secondary passage he'd spotted during reconnaissance. The marriage bond book was tucked securely inside her shirt, evidence safe, even if they didn't survive to deliver it. They crawled through narrow tunnel as the mine collapsed around them, explosions shaking the mountain, while smoke and superheated air made breathing nearly impossible. Behind them, Malloy's screams echoed as burning timber pinned him against a wall. But Gerard's voice was still audible, cursing even as his empire burned. The secondary tunnel led to a ventilation shaft, bringing them back to surface just as the main entrance collapsed, sealing Malloy's fate beneath tons of rock and timber. But Gerard had found another exit and was stumbling across the mountainside, clothes smoking and left side of his face charred by flames. In his hands was a revolver, eyes holding madness of a man who'd lost everything but refused to accept defeat. "You think you've won," he snarled, raising the weapon toward Theodora with hands shaking from pain and fury. "I have resources, connections, influence reaching the territorial capital. Even if you escape tonight, I'll hunt you down." The shot that echoed through the canyon didn't come from Gerard's revolver. Deputy Peacemaker stood 50 yards away, smoking rifle in his hands, and tears streaming down his weathered face. "My boy died this afternoon," Peacemaker said quietly, voice carrying clearly in mountain air. "Died coughing blood while you counted profits from poisoning our water. I won't let you hurt anyone else." Gerard's pistol fell from nerveless fingers as he collapsed the marriage bond book still clutched in Theodora's hands. Around them, the mountain burned with fires that would smolder for days, but evidence that could expose his criminal empire was finally safe. Judge Harrison arrived in Broken Wheel 5 days after the mine fire, his federal marshal escort finding a community still thick with smoke and bitter smell of burned timber. The lean man with steel-gray hair had witnessed too much frontier justice, but even his experience was shaken by comprehensive evidence presented in the partially reconstructed hotel. 23 documented cases of forced marriage for property theft, he said, reading from the ledger. Multiple counts of bribery, environmental destruction, conspiracy, and actual homicide disguised as accidents. This represents one of the most comprehensive criminal enterprises I've encountered in 30 years. Johann sat in the front row, face gaunt from grief. His son had died 2 days after the mine fire, another victim of poisoned water. The Swedish Farmers' Journal had proven invaluable in documenting environmental crimes, but justice came too late for his family. The defendant, Alphonse Gerard, will face territorial trial for conspiracy fraud, multiple attempted murders, and public nuisance and riparian rights violations under territorial law. His mining claims are placed under territorial equity receivership pending damage resolution. Gerard sat in restraints, the left side of his face still bandaged. The confident mine owner who'd controlled an entire region through fear had been replaced by a broken man aged decades in days. Furthermore, all marriages conducted under coercion are declared null and void. Affected women will have property rights restored and receive compensation from equity receivership funds. It was justice, but at devastating cost. Broken Wheel had lost its sheriff telegraph office, schoolhouse, and several businesses. The mine closure meant unemployment for dozens, though most were discussing moves to other claims or returning to farming now that water was beginning to run clean. In Isidore's reconstructed clinic, Enepe sat motionless as Theodora cleaned and rebandaged his bullet wound, her touch gentle but thorough. The healing progressed well, but frontier medicine remained more art than science. "Does it still hurt?" she asked, securing fresh bandage with practiced efficiency. "Less than it did," he replied, studying her face as she worked. "You've become accomplished at field surgery." "I had excellent motivation to learn quickly." She met his eyes directly. "And what happens to us now?" the question they'd both avoided while focusing on testimony and helping their community recover. The marriage ultimatum that brought them together had been revealed as fraudulent manipulation, leaving them free to go separate ways without obligations. "I've been offered a permanent position with Territorial Land Office," Theodora said, hands still resting on his shoulder. "Based in the capital, working to prevent this corruption from developing elsewhere. It would mean independence, steady income, meaningful reform work." "That sounds like exactly what you deserve," Enepe said, though something in his voice suggested personal cost. "You have skills that could help people throughout the territory. And you? Will you stay to help reconstruction? There's talk of hiring experienced scouts to monitor mining operations, ensuring compliance with new environmental regulations. Steady work with clear purpose, and someone needs to advocate for small farmers and ranchers." They were circling the real question, whether bonds forged in shared danger could survive in ordinary circumstances. They'd learned complete dependence on each other. But was that foundation strong enough for relationship based on choice rather than necessity? "There's something else," Theodora said, pulling out a folded document from Malloy's strongbox. This land survey was hidden among his effects. Enepe studied the official territorial survey that had been concealed from public records. It revealed water rights to substantial portions of Upper Dry River Valley rights belonging to Theodora through her father's estate. At the stamp mill, mercury troughs used for amalgamation left bright films along the sluices, and arsenic-laced tailings seeped into Dry River, explaining the metallic taste, dying fish, and rashes on the children. At the stamp mill, mercury troughs used for amalgamation left bright films along the sluices, and arsenic-laced tailings seeped into Dry River, explaining the metallic taste, dying fish, and rashes on the children. Your father was more of a land speculator than you realized, Enepe observed, noting the holding's extent and strategic importance. These rights cover thousands of acres of prime grazing and farming land, enough to support multiple families or substantial ranching operations. She agreed. But I don't want to become another absentee landowner exploiting local resources. I want to use these rights to help people like Johann rebuild on sustainable terms. Managing land rights requires detailed knowledge of territorial law, water management, seasonal patterns, crop rotation. It's not work that can be done remotely. No, she said, meeting his gaze with quiet intensity. It would require someone staying permanently building community relationships, understanding the land through direct experience. They looked at each other across the clinic's small space, both understanding what was being discussed without stating it directly. The land rights represented not just economic opportunity, but reason to stay together, a way to build something meaningful, combining their complementary skills. It would be true partnership, Theodora said carefully, voice carrying undertones of possibility. Business arrangement between equals with shared responsibilities and authority over major decisions. With shared risks and benefits, Enepe added, recognizing the offer and trust it represented, and shared commitment to protecting people and environment of this valley. Neither spoke marriage directly, but it hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Not the forced union Gerard had tried to manipulate, but voluntary choice based on mutual respect, common purpose, and deep affection that had grown naturally from shared survival. Outside sun was setting over recovering broken wheel painting sky in gold and crimson that promised better days. The immediate crisis was over. Justice served, and future stretched before them like unmarked territory, waiting exploration. 6 months later, morning mist rose from Dry River like incense from some vast natural cathedral, carrying scents of clean water and new grass, speaking of healing and renewal. At the stamp mill, mercury troughs used for amalgamation left bright films along the sluices, and arsenic-laced tailings seeped into dry river, explaining the metallic taste, dying fish, and rashes on the children. At the stamp mill, mercury troughs used for amalgamation left bright films along the sluices, and arsenic-laced tailings seeped into dry river, explaining the metallic taste, dying fish, and rashes on the children. Enepe stood at the survey marker, where the new settlement bridge would connect Upper Valley to the main territorial road hands, steady as he held measuring chain, while Theodora recorded precise angles in her leather-bound notebook. They had been at this work since before dawn, laying out property boundaries for families who'd chosen to settle under the cooperative land use agreement they'd established through months of careful negotiation. It was precise, methodical work, requiring absolute trust between partners, trust that had grown naturally from shared commitment to protecting both people and environment of their adopted home. Bearing northeast 15 degrees, 200 yards to the cottonwood marker, Theodora called out her voice, carrying easily across morning stillness. She had adapted to frontier life with resilience that continued surprising everyone. Her Eastern education, combined with hard-won practical experience, had made her one of the territory's most respected land surveyors and environmental consultants. The territorial government had adopted their valley management system as a model for other mining-damaged regions, bringing steady streams of officials and reformers who wanted to study their innovative approach to balancing economic development with environmental stewardship. Johan's reconstructed farm was visible from their position, his new barn standing amid fields of healthy corn and beans, testifying to clean water flowing through irrigation channels. The Swedish immigrant had remarried a widow from Iron Will, whose children had also been affected by mining pollution, and their combined families were thriving under the cooperative's protective arrangements. That completes the Henderson allocation, Theodora said, closing her notebook with satisfaction. We're actually ahead of schedule. They walked back toward their horses, which grazed peacefully near aspens planted as memorial to children who died from contaminated water. The trees were growing well, their distinctive shimmer, making them a beacon of remembrance visible from miles away. The partnership they had forged was functioning better than either had dared hope. Not just the business arrangement managing land rights and environmental protection, but the deeper connection that had evolved from mutual respect into something richer than either had expected to find on the harsh frontier. They had married in the end, but not conventionally. Their ceremony had been conducted by a Lakota medicine man who understood spiritual significance of unions crossing cultural boundaries, witnessed by the entire Valley community that had come to depend on their partnership for both practical leadership and moral guidance. Deputy Peacemaker, now promoted to sheriff with overwhelming community support, had provided security for the ceremony. His loss had transformed him into a passionate advocate for environmental protection, channeling grief into meaningful reform work that honored his son's memory. Any regrets? Enepe asked quietly the question that had become gentle ritual during moments of reflection. Theodora considered seriously running her mind over the path from that desperate night by storm-swollen river to this moment of quiet satisfaction. She'd traded Eastern society security for frontier partnerships, uncertainties, formal marriage, for something more complex and egalitarian, individual achievement, for collaborative success. None, she said with absolute conviction. This feels right. We feel right. They stood together at the valley's edge, watching sun burn away mist to reveal productive farmland, healthy forests, and clean water, sparkling like liquid diamonds in morning light. Their hands found each other, naturally fingers intertwining with unconscious ease of partnership, tested by fire and proven stronger than any legal document. In the distance, surveyors' stakes marked the route of new railroad spur, connecting their valley to markets in Iron Will and beyond. Progress was coming, but it would be progress balanced with land and people protection, sustainable development they'd fought to establish, through months of legal battles and political negotiation. Ready for the next section? Theodora asked, shouldering her surveyor's pack. Always, Enepe replied, checking the compass that would guide them to their next assignment. They mounted their horses and rode toward the rising sun, partners in every sense that mattered, their future stretching ahead like unmarked territory they would map together. Behind them, Dry River ran clear and clean through the valley they'd fought to protect, carrying promises of renewal and hope that justice could sometimes prevail when ordinary people found courage to stand together against impossible odds. At the stamp mill, mercury troughs used for amalgamation left bright films along the sluices, and arsenic-laced tailings seeped into Dry River, explaining the metallic taste, dyeing fish and rashes on the children. At the stamp mill, mercury troughs used for amalgamation left bright films along the sluices, and arsenic-laced tailings seeped into Dry River, explaining the metallic taste, dyeing fish and rashes on the children. The story that began with desperate rescue in storm-swollen river had become something larger, testament to partnership's power, healing's possibility, and truth that love could flourish in harshest circumstances when built on mutual respect and shared purpose foundations. The frontier was vast and full of challenges, but they would meet those challenges together, just as they had learned to do on that first night, when fate and floodwaters brought them together beside a river that had forever changed both their lives.